Well, welcome to today's session. First, I'd like to welcome our audience here on site and our audience digitally. My name's Carmen from One Young World. It is my pleasure to introduce in a minute just today's next session. I want to just quickly remind you all that we will have a Q&A part at the end. For those of you on site, you can raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you. For those attending digitally, you can submit the the code that you'll see on screen on slido.com. And all your questions will come through and we'll be able to read them out loud here. And with no further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce this next session, Can Youth Activism Save the Planet? So please bring a big round of applause and welcome on stage Sarah Jabir, Anna Kernam, sorry if I butchered that, Scarlett Westbrook, and Dylan Hamilton.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming here today. If any of you was here for my colleague Rose's panel, she did an incredible job. So I will try to follow up with that one, but again, we have a very, very, very fun session happening today. We're gonna ask you guys tons of questions, so feel free to ask whatever you want. We have three of the, honestly, most amazing youth climate justice activists from everywhere. So I know you guys really, really enjoy this panel. So as this panel is called, Can Youth Activism Save the Planet? Just a little bit more information about what we're doing. So we will be exploring the role that youth have in the climate activism movement and the mechanisms in which youth can get involved. Importantly, we'll also be looking at whether the onus to mitigate climate change should even be placed on young people in the first place, and the associated consequence that has with it. So looking at the mental, emotional, physical burden that this places on them. We'll also be looking at the link between education and youth activism, looking at sites of education that are conventional, like schools and universities, but also unconventional sites like social media platforms, TikTok, Twitter, that has seen a huge rise in prominence recently. And very importantly as well, we'll be looking at intersectionality and inclusiveness or inclusivity, and looking at how, whether the youth activism area within climate is actually inclusive and representing a host of intersectional backgrounds. So really important thing. But before we get started, I really want to introduce our amazing, amazing panel here. We have got some really ridiculously talented and skilled and successful youth climate activists. So I'll start with Anna. They are an amazing climate activists based in Northern Ireland. They are the founder of Fridays for Future and also the recipient of the Amnesty International Bravery Award. They also have they organize climate strikes every single week to raise awareness for climate issues and ecological issues too. Then we have equally as amazing Dylan Hamilton. He is a climate activist based here right in Scotland. He's a local Glaswegian, which is amazing to have a local right here with us. He is also an organizer of Fridays for Future, but here in Scotland. And he's also the recipient of the Scot of the Year 2020 award. So yeah, awards all over the place. And he is also an incredible trans rights activist too. And last but definitely not least, we have the incredible Scarlett Westbrook. She is a British native and she does climate strikes both in Birmingham and on a national scale. She's also an award-winning journalist, an amazing climate policy writer, and she's also the head of political engagement and spokesperson at UKSCN and at Teach for Future. And a great fun fact, she is also the youngest person in the world to have an A-level in government and politics, which she self-taught herself at the age of 13. So as you can see, these young people have probably done more than most of us have in our entire lifetime. So there's a lot to be learned from them. And I know we'll have a great session. So just to begin, I really want to ask you guys, how did you guys get started in climate activism? What age did you guys get started? What inspired you to do it? What was like a trigger? Just tell us more a bit about that. So maybe Scarlett, if you want to start.
Is this on? Yeah, okay, cool. I was 10 years old, so when I was 10, it was the year before the Paris Convention and the year before the 2015 general election. So the news was full of politicians pledging climate policies and their promises for what they do on the climate if they were elected in. And in year 5, I had a homework to read the news, and I read the news and saw, the extent of the climate crisis and how we can actually solve it through policy. And I know we haven't seen any action, but policy does have the potential to solve the climate crisis, even though that potential isn't used. And that kind of sparked me to do stuff. So when I was 10, I started door knocking for 2 political parties, which is really weird, but I was 10, because I liked their climate policies, and I had my parents like trailing behind me, and both of them weren't in any political parties themselves. They just had a 10-year-old who was forcing them to let their 10-year-old knock on random people's doors to vote for the climate.
Anna?
Well, I'd been involved in other types of social activism from when I was about 13 in various groups, but I started doing more about the climate specifically whenever the Paris Agreement came about, and then I joined Fridays for Future. And then that's where I got massively into it, and it's my entire life.
Dylan?
Yeah, I first kind of became aware of it when I was about 7 or 8, and I joined my school's eco group, and that was kind of when I started to become very cynical, because we'd been told about, you know, the ice caps melting, the classic stuff you tell kids about polar bears, and then all we did was like take out the recycling bins, and that didn't make much sense to me. So I kind of stopped doing that things, and it felt a bit useless for a while. But then when I was about 12 or 13, I started doing like local activism with the council and things like that. And then when I turned 14 was when the Fridays for Future movement started. And I joined that in February 2019.
Amazing. I think it's crazy how young you guys started. You know, I think it kind of debunks the whole misconception that you have to be 18, 20, 30 to actually, you know, start making a name for yourself and doing change in, you know, regards to climate. So thank you so much for sharing, you know, your stories. And just to kind of follow off from that, I really want to know what you guys think about the role that young people have in the climate change movement. You know, like, why is it so important for young voices to be amplified? Why do young people need to be at the forefront of decision making? Dylan, if you want to go, and we can just carry on.
Yeah, I think it's a very broad movement, and we're certainly not the center of it, even though recently we've become quite a big of the big focus in it. I think it's easier for us to just say what we want to say, because I don't have to worry about like losing a job or what my colleagues will think of me. I just say what I want to say, and I think we also convey the urgency quite well, just because I mean, most climate models finish around 2100, and it's entirely possible that we will see that date. So yeah, I don't know if I'm going to go on too much. An analogy I like to use is the boiling frog one. So when you put a frog in cold water and slowly heat it up, it will actually boil to death. But if you throw it into already hot water, it'll jump immediately out. And I feel like that kind of represents the young people, because it's been a slow building process for older people. But for us, we're being told when we're like 8 that the climate is warming and it's going to destroy so many lives, and then we're told to just get on with our lives, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy that I will be using. I think it makes sense then why we see so many more young people compared to, you know, a generation ago, you know, talking about climate change and trying to make a difference. So thank you for sharing that. Anna, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the parts that makes young people more into it is that a lot of us started before we were 18, or we still are under 18, so we don't have a right to vote in most countries and things like that. So we don't, taking to the streets in the way that Fridays for Future does is our only way to express what we think and to have our say and to be involved in democracy and things like that. And we also have had less imprint on people. You know, people tend to become more conservative as they get older, but we aren't afraid to just say exactly what we think. And I think it's also because although we've known about the climate crisis for decades, it's only starting to come into the media now. And that's our generation. You know, we hear a lot about how the climate crisis is an issue for future generations, but that's not true anymore. That future generation has come, and it's us. So we have more at stake, because as you can see all over the world, the climate crisis is already affecting people. People are already dying from it. And we're the generation that are seeing that with our own eyes rather than it being predictions.
And Scarlett?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to reiterate the points that Dylan and Anna have put forward. As disenfranchised people, we don't have a way to express our views through the ballot box. So we have to, you know, take to the streets and go to other forms of protest which aren't perhaps traditionally used to practice democracy. But, you know, from a global perspective, many young people have already been on the front line of the climate crisis. Whilst we can maybe recreationally engage with this because we live in the global north and aren't as threatened, that's not an option for people And whilst we can sit here and call ourselves activists, people on the front line of the climate crisis are just called, survivors or people living normally. And I think that's perhaps also something that's an interesting, divide almost, because when we talk to our friends who live in the so-called global south, they'll have memories, really recent memories of dealing with floods or typhoons or something like that. So it's become a point where we're not thinking about just our futures, but also about our presence, our friends' presence, our families who live in other countries, particularly if we're, people of colour and people from diaspora, marginalised communities. And yeah, I think it's sort of not a choice anymore because it's already here. We need to fight for a better world, and that better world can't be 10 years in the future, but today, and we do have the power to do that as the sixth largest economy. It's just about getting politicians to act on that, and they definitely know the urgency, so their choice not to implement the change is a political one, which we need to change.
No, I think that's a fantastic point to make. Also, with both of your points about how, young people are usually disenfranchised. They can't vote, especially if they're under the age of 18. And so there's this entire kind of, demonization of protests and movements because they're like, why don't you just use traditional forms of, policy change? Why don't you vote or run for an MP or run as a youth councillor? But a lot of the times, that's not actually a viable option for young people who are below the voting age and can't actually, walk into parliament and make change them. So protests are the only way. And so they are a very, very important mechanism for policy change. So thank you for highlighting that. That was something I did not actually think about. So today, like we were saying, we see so many young people at the forefront of climate activism. But, everyone's talking about how, young people have the key to the world, young people should be the ones solving climate change. But a really good question is, should the onus to mitigate climate change even be placed on young people? It's not young people's fault. A lot of the time, climate change and environmental degradation was way past its tipping points, even before a lot of the young people were even born. So why is everyone now saying, these young people, they actually had no part to play in it, but they're the key for it, Should the onus even be on you guys? Dylan?
I think simply it's quite easy to pass the blame. I think a lot of people kind of put our generation on this pedestal and say we're very cool and we're amazing and the kids are all right, but I don't think that's true because I guess in the global north, or particularly the UK, environmentalism and climate activism before us was more kind of passion thing. It was a hobby. It was, I really like nature, so I want to protect it. Whereas now for us, like Scarlett and Anna were saying, it's much more of an urgency thing. We're seeing the effects right now. We worry for our friends. So I don't think it should be on us, but I think a lot of us couldn't look ourselves in the eye if we didn't do something. And it would help a lot if adults could stop saying the kids are all right. Yeah.
Do you want to go, Anna, next?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the time, young people feel a moral responsibility to do something. I don't know about you guys, but when you read the IPCC reports, you can't just unread them. It changes you as a person, and it's so terrifying. And that fear is really motivating, and I think that's what gets a lot of us out of bed and up to protests and things like that, because we feel we have actually no other option, and you feel really guilty when you don't do anything for even just a few hours. Whereas even then, we aren't the people who caused that. It's the people in the previous generation who have caused it, but we are dealing with the effects of it. And so whenever we are taking to the streets, we're not doing that to try and solve the crisis. We're doing it to raise awareness of the crisis, because if we were to wait until we were old enough to be in positions of power, it would be too late. We need the people who are already in a position to change things to do their jobs. It's not difficult. We're asking them to do the bare minimum, which is their job. So I think that the onus shouldn't be on young people, because young people haven't done anything wrong.
And last but not least,
I think that the focus on young people is definitely a way for big corporations and governments to shift the blame of the climate crisis onto people who haven't predominantly contributed to it. And this is even present in our education system. When most of us think about the first time we came across the climate crisis, it was probably when we were tallying up our carbon footprint in primary school. So by the time we're teenagers, we've already got this subconscious thought that it's our fault. Like maybe if we volunteered to be an eco-monitor in year one, or I don't know, turned off the lights a bit more, we could have solved the climate crisis, and it's our fault. But that's actually not the case, and I do think, as Dylan also said, that this is, you know, a distraction tactic ultimately. The onus definitely shouldn't be on young people. Obviously, young people is like a very relative term. Some people mean it as up to 35, some might mean under 18s. Ultimately, there are some young people who have contributed to the climate crisis, whether that's like billionaires like Kylie Jenner or the children of fossil fuel executives. But, you know, as a society, the people with the blame for the climate crisis are the 100 corporations who are responsible for 71% of emissions, and the governments across the world who have failed for decade upon decade to take the necessary action that we need, despite knowing the urgency of the matter and the science behind it. So should the onus be on young people? No. But do we sort of have a choice here? Not really, because if we don't act, who will?
Exactly. Completely agree. And just stemming on from what, you know, all of you said, and Dylan, especially you, about how people always have this tendency to be like, yeah, young people can save the day. You know, there's a tendency to romanticize youth climate activism, be like, oh, it's the key to changing the world. It's amazing. Like, look at these young people. But, you know, I know, and you guys know, that there's a lot of sacrifice and hardships that come with being a youth climate activist. You know, I was talking to Anna recently, and they just told me that they had to take 2 weeks off from work just to come to COP. And while everyone thought that they were going on vacation somewhere, they were working hard every single day for 2 weeks. And so there is a mental, physical, emotional, spiritual burden that this has on you guys, despite the tendency to romanticize and infantilize you guys and be like, yeah, it's just them, you know, taking up a hobby. And so do you guys think there is a huge burden that this has on you? You know, when your friends are going out for Friday night, you know, and you are memorizing a new climate policy to read out that weekend. Maybe Scarlett, if you want to go first.
I think that the romanticization and also commercialization of the climate movement has made the climate activism look as though it's, you know, quite recreational and easy to engage with, and like sort of light-hearted. And that's definitely not the case, because it has so many like burdens that come with it. I feel like burden is a difficult word to use here, because whilst we're memorizing policy or attending protests as people who are actively, you know, dying from the climate crisis, so in a way we're privileged, because the way we get to engage with the climate crisis is through things that won't really put us into harm's way, unless we get arrested or something like that. But again, that's perhaps, you know, a mild compromise when other people have it so much worse. But at that, you know, there's not like a limit on how much suffering there is in the world, so it's hard for us too, even if it is worse for others. And that definitely comes through, you know, not having restrictions on your social life because you're meeting with a politician who's probably going to call you a stupid child, or organising a protest, arguing with the council about using spaces for protests, that sort of stuff. But I think, you know, in the global north, we ultimately like have a better deal than most others have it, and I think that's a position of privilege that we really need to acknowledge. And whilst it's, you know, really difficult and really awful, we kind of have to like acknowledge that we are choosing actively to engage with this. Other people don't have that choice, and that choice itself is a privilege. And even then, you know, people of colour, especially in the global north, our family members have lost their lives, have been drastically affected by the climate crisis, and those stories of, you know, intergenerational trauma and family hardship are something you can't really shake off. So whilst it's hard, it's still a choice for us, and we're choosing to do this despite all of the things it comes with, though we can still complain about it because it's difficult.
Yeah, I think that's really important, having that self-reflection to be like, you know, yes, this takes a toll on me, but also knowing, hey, it's still privileged that I'm in the position that I am in now, where I can choose to engage in climate change. Because a lot of people in the global south, a lot of the people at the forefront of all these, you know, natural catastrophes don't have that choice. So that was a really kind of important bit of positionality. Thank you so much. Maybe Dylan and then Anna?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really hard. It's exhausting. It's definitely separates you from your peers, but at the same time, I don't think I would be doing anything else. Because of that suffering we see. If people don't have the choice, and I do, then it's my moral obligation to make that choice. But at the same time, yeah, it's definitely separated me from a very, even remotely normal life, to be honest. In 2020, I totally messed up my prelims mock exams, which ended up determining my entire grade because I'd been at COP25. And witnessing that abuse of power really mentally changed me, I think. Before I used to I wanted to be a musician, I wanted to do the arts, and now I barely have time to do that anymore. And it's a shame, but at the same time, I don't think I could look myself in the eye again, like Anna was saying about, you can't read that stuff and then just look away.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think there is a tendency, like I said, that people don't think there's a whole kind of background of hard work that goes in when, young people engage in climate activism. There's always like an assumption that, they have the time, like they're not working 9 to 5 most of the time. Like they have the time, they have the interest, and they don't have all these responsibilities, but I don't think people actually realize how much sacrifice that goes behind that. So thank you so much, Dylan, for sharing that. Anna?
Yeah, I completely agree with what has been said so far, but I think something to add is that we shouldn't, although suffering is relative, and so of course people are dying every day, but there should be no suffering at all. If the system was working correctly and if it was the correct system in place, then we wouldn't need to have climate activists. The fact that there are youth climate activists, the climate activists are taking gap years from school, they're leaving school, they're not doing well in school, they're not able to work, they're having to put absolutely everything into this thing that they shouldn't actually have to do. It's the people in power, it's the world leaders, the CEOs that aren't acting morally as they should, that is then causing that destruction. So I think it's a bit bizarre that then young people in more privileged countries are then doing these things to try and help other young people in less privileged countries. It is quite bizarre when you think about it in that way. But I also think that even if it may be a choice to go into climate activism, it may seem like a choice, but it's not really. It's a very black and white thing. Either you do nothing and we cause the 6th mass extinction, or we do absolutely everything and we try and put pressure on governments and hold them accountable. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Anna. And just going off what you said, you mentioned it a bit, but I'd love to hear more about what you guys think. We talk about our privilege and being in a position where you can actually engage in climate change, choosing to do so, because a lot of people in the global south don't have that opportunity. They don't have that privilege a lot of the time. Do you guys feel some sort of responsibility as young people, to amplify the voices of those who don't have that platform just yet? How are you using your privilege? How do you feel a connection to those in the global south, or even to those in the global north who aren't necessarily as privileged in the climate activism movement? Whoever wants to go ahead.
I'll go. I think that, yes, I think we do a lot of work in trying to get MAPA at the forefront, the most affected people in areas, because they're the people that should be listened to. So for a lot of prep for COP was helping people get visas, get badges, get funding for accommodation and travel, so that we could get those voices to the forefront, because COP has been massively whitewashed and greenwashed. There has been so much racism, sexism, transphobia that we've seen. And so I think that there is a big gap in the privilege there that we can see even in the past week or so. And so we have been trying to put those voices at the forefront, but it can be quite difficult, because then we can't control what the media then report on it. We can put everyone at the front of the banner being MAPA, but they'll still point their cameras at the white person who's standing at the side.
That's a really good point. I think, you can try your best to provide them with the resources, but they may not be able to control it because of a lot of the people at the top who are doing it for them. So thank you for sharing that. Dylan?
Yeah, especially with COP being here, we've had a huge sense of responsibility here, because we were organising the protests. It was our job to pick who the speakers were and make sure that the right people were platformed. So yeah, there's definitely been a huge sense of we need to make sure that the people from the most affected areas are the ones speaking on the stage. And we had at least 20 amazing speakers, and they still waited to the end to hear the one white person and then platform that voice. So it's very difficult when the people who need to be receiving it don't want to receive it. But of course we have to keep trying as hard as we can, and if it means eventually having 0 white activists, even if it's just the risk that maybe they don't cover the protest at all, but I think that's risks we have to start taking.
Scarlett?
I'm not sure if I agree with what's been said previously. I don't think there is an effort to include people from the so-called global south. You know, it's one thing chucking people in for a media interview and another actually organising with them, you know, centering people's voices when you're organising an action and making sure you're doing things with people and not just say you're chucking on a token person from the global south onto a panel or a speech, which I think is something that's mostly happening within the Fridays for Future movement especially, but in the wider climate movement, to have, you know, complete and representative action, we need to make sure that we're not just putting people of colour at the front of marches that they were barred out of organising, but actually put on those decision-making Zooms or meetings and actually incorporated into the decision-making process. And we also need to look at the sort of organising we're doing too on a wider climate movement-y scale. When we look at Extinction Rebellion pushing forward deliberate arrests, that's not something that's accessible to disabled people and people of colour because we're more likely to be, you know, arrested or prosecuted and that sort of stuff. So we need to look at how we're making actions accessible too. And then on the case of, you know, including more people from the so-called global south, often people from the global south who are able to engage in climate activism in a traditional Western sense of talking to politicians and speaking to the media are quite older than what we perhaps are because they have to go to university, get jobs, and, you know, find all of those material conditions that we take for granted to be able to engage with this. And I think we also need to look at not just engaging with people who are perhaps on a more similar, you know, economically and materially privileged level to us, but actually reach out to those on the front lines who are doing activism in literally rebuilding communities, you know, building sustainable community structures so the next time a flood hits, they and their family survive, and actually, you know, incorporate people, not just people who are like us, but everybody who's being affected by the climate crisis. And we also need to remember that, like, again, lack of privilege isn't necessarily a competition. People of colour in the global north especially are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. We saw the really tragic passing of Ella Kissy Deborah, who was 9 years old, the first person in the world to have air pollution on her death certificate. And that's the case for so many people of colour who are having, in the UK especially, years shaved off their lives, or decades, like in the case of Ella, because of drastic levels of air pollution, which we're more likely to live in areas that have heavy levels of air pollution. We're more likely to live in geographically vulnerable areas. We need to remember that in everything that we do in our movement. You know, like, just because people of colour live in the global north doesn't mean we have the same privileges as white people who live in the global north, and that needs to be remembered too. Lots of people from FFF MAPA, which stands for Most Affected Places and Areas, have said in the last few days especially how they really feel like they've been tokenised, and that's because we're in Glasgow where, you know, people of colour die disproportionately because of air pollution levels, yet that hasn't been platformed whilst they've been chucked on camera interviews just so the movement can look diverse, to talk about experiences perhaps completely unrelated to what's going on in the area. So I think we need to, with the media as well, it's not a competition about who gets, you know, that spotlight, because the media is willing to platform people of colour. That's why, you know, I've been in the media, so with people like Vanessa Nakate, Anjali Ram Middleton, and hundreds of people I could go on and list. It's not a competition for space or attention, but rather we need to sort of put ourselves back. If that means not doing a media interview or maybe not hosting a Zoom, we need to take that hit and make sure that everyone's incorporated at every level of that decision-making process and not just put there for a photo opportunity.
Thank you. No, I think it's great, especially the point about people of color in the global north and the south being excluded from climate activism and facing the most disproportionate effects. It actually reminded me of a story of when I wanted to go to a climate protest in London. And I remember some of the organizers telling me, like, hey, what passport do you have? And I was like, oh, like, I don't have a British one. And they're like, oh, then I don't think you should come, because if you don't have a British passport, you're at risk of, you know, having your visa revoked or being deported if you're caught in a climate protest. And I remember thinking, like, hey, this is affecting me, but just because, you know, I'm a person of color, not from, you know, the global north per se, it's excluding people like us even when we are in the global north. So that is a very important distinction to make. People of color in the global south and the north both face very similar kind of forms of discrimination. And I think this actually goes really well into our next question, which is how do we ensure that the world of youth climate activism is inclusive? How do we make sure that it is representative of people from a wide host of intersectional backgrounds? And that could be to do with ability, race, gender, sexuality, settlement status, so on and so on. And I know this is a really big question because I'm basically asking like how do we make it fair? How do we make the movement equal and just and equitable and just all around intersectional? So I know it's a difficult question, but it would be great if you guys could shed some light on what you think. I know we have 3 activists right here who are from very different intersectional backgrounds that can host a lot of, provide a lot of information about this. So Anna, maybe if you'd like to start.
Well, as a white person, I feel like I can't comment on the racism part of privilege and integration of equality, but something I think that we could work on as a movement is the ableism aspect. I know whenever we had the climate strikes on Friday and Saturday, both me and my friend had to leave early because of sensory overload, because she has ADHD and I have autism. And I think I know it's something, protests are loud and things like that, but I think it's something we could look at even in spaces with Zoom calls and things like that, and people getting annoyed when you fidget in meetings, but that's a way that you concentrate. And it can be a way of there's things we can do to include people. And I also think that the media in general will probably dictate those things and kind of reflect on us internally as well, because it's kind of how people perceive us.
Dylan?
I also can't comment on the racism aspect, but I don't think we can answer how we become intersectional because we aren't, and I don't know any movement that fully is. Because of the society that we live in, nothing really is intersectional. The system isn't built to be like that, so there's always going to be people who feel they can't get involved because they have those dangers, because it's more dangerous for them to protest, and therefore they're not going to get involved, and those worries are completely valid because we live in a system that has taught us to ignore certain voices. But yeah, there are lots of aspects we can do better in, which definitely ableism is a very big one. A march is very hard to make accessible, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try as hard as we can to make it accessible. And yeah, I think an area we're maybe doing decently in would be we have a very high number of LGBT activists and a surprisingly high number of autistic activists, actually. And I think that only makes the movement stronger because you have that variety of different people. And I guess another area we need to improve on would also be the class aspect, because working class people are obviously going to feel the effects first. And there's definitely some idea that working class people don't care about climate change, which just is not true. And so we definitely need to do better in so many aspects.
Great point. And last but not least.
The climate movement is diverse. That's because it's global, and although people in the so-called global south on the front lines of the climate crisis aren't attending Zooms and hosting protests, that doesn't mean that they're not climate activists. Activists, especially over the last few years with the rise of social media, has sort of lost its meaning and has perhaps become more of a term for general advocate. But if you're on the front line of the climate crisis, building back a community, you're an advocate for climate justice, because that's what climate justice in practice looks like. In terms of climate activism in the so-called global north, it's still diverse here. It's perhaps just not in certain spaces people are referring to, and that's because of a lot of reasons, of inaccessibility. So in terms of what we can do to make spaces better for everybody, there's lots of easy things to do. Firstly, include people from all backgrounds in your decision-making processes. That doesn't have to be tokenistic. If you're a truly just movement, then you'll become diverse naturally and organically, because you'll be a welcoming space for everyone. And it's sort of important you don't force that, but also that when racism or other forms of discrimination happen, you stamp it out and make it clear that you're building an actively anti-discriminatory atmosphere. Then practical things perhaps everyone here can do is, if you're on a Zoom, you can have people summarizing things in the chat. So people who are hard of hearing or are neurodivergent can still follow stuff up if it's in the chat. Let people fidget around. At protests, there should always be a sort of quiet space for people. That's something we often do in Birmingham and London too a lot. And that's really helpful for people to just go and chill out. Also, yeah, we need to make sure we have accessible marches too. Lots of bigger marches do this where there's 2 march routes. Say one's a really long one that people who are like more mobile could go down, and one's a shorter one. And when you plan a march, make sure you look at what public transport routes it goes down to, so people can just hop on a bus and still be included. You know, just incorporate access into every aspect of everything. It's actually not hard because like we're in the 21st century, there's a lot of modifications now. You just need to perhaps think about it a bit more, and that's not too strenuous for anyone to not do.
No, great. And I think one kind of big takeaway from this is also the idea that we need to kind of expand our definition of what a youth climate activist is, right? Like, just because this climate activist is not at COP or is not on a Zoom call or is not on social media does not necessarily mean that they are not equally a climate activist as much as you guys are. They can perform in different ways, and especially like you mentioned in the global south, they would do it in various other ways. You know, they see the natural catastrophes happening at the forefront of their lives, environmental degradation everywhere, and so their protesting is going to be very different from what we see here, but that doesn't make them any less of a climate activist. So I think that's a very kind of important point to remember and to expand that as well. And we want to just touch on the one last question before we hit the Q&A. I know there's tons of questions that people want to ask you guys. But what advice would you give to other young people looking to make change in the climate arena? You know, it can be very daunting when they don't know how to begin. You know, they may not have the support. And what kind of would be the one general piece of advice you would give other young people watching us right now who are like, hey, I want to do what they're doing. Like, I want to try and make change. I want to go out there. I want to have, you know, the ability to do something. I want to feel empowered. What advice, based on the experiences that you guys have had, would you give to everyone else? Anna, if you'd like to start.
Well, I think if you're talking about getting involved in Fridays for Future specifically, I mean, we always say everyone is welcome, everyone is needed, and I think it can be very daunting if you don't know anyone or you've only seen things on Twitter or Instagram. But if you show up to pretty much any of the local groups, like the closest one to you, you'll see that everyone will welcome you and be like, hi, how are you? Like, what's your name? And everyone will be really inclusive and will try and like be friendly. Like, I don't think there's anyone who I've talked to who's been like, no, like, go away. We don't want you here. Like generally we're all just young people who are probably a similar age to you and therefore have similar experiences, and we'll just be like, hi, welcome, here's a placard. It's not as scary as you think it is, but it's one of those things that once you do it once, it'll get easier, and you just have to stick at it.
Scarlett, if you'd like to go next.
I think one piece of advice is to remember it's not going to be, like, your activism journey isn't going to be the same as everyone else's. And also that there's lots of different ways to get involved in working towards climate justice, whether that's doing mutual aid in your local community through, like, you know, doing food deliveries to people who are currently still shielding from COVID-19, or older people who aren't able to go out, whether it's donating to food banks, writing to politicians, attending protests, organising protests, doing assemblies at your school or workplace or something like that. All of these things are a step towards a more just world. Even if they're not perhaps speaking to the media and organising protests, they're still equally valuable, and there's a place for everyone in this movement. You know, like graphic designers, people to make tea and coffee at protests or in meetings, writers, we need social media people. There's a space for everyone, and that space might not be like someone who you look up to is taking up, but it doesn't mean it's like less valid or less valuable.
And Dylan?
I'd probably say it's a very long process, and you might get very, very frustrated at the start because you're not at the same level where other people are. But obviously when I joined, I didn't know how to do anything. I couldn't have told you half of the stuff I know now. You've probably more than that, to be honest. So I guess just like be kind to yourself. You can join. So like in FFF Scotland, we have onboarding sessions. We give you a buddy, so you can have someone you can ask questions who will know more. But also figuring out what your skills are. So everybody contributes differently. So I figured that I like to write, so I tend to write a lot of our, you know, structuring documents and the press releases and stuff. But maybe you're very artsy, so you're good at making our graphics and banners and signs. Maybe you're into music and tech, and then you can help set up our systems for rallies. Maybe you're good at talking to people and you can do outreach. There's really a role for everybody, so it's just go in and figure out what you like, and I promise we're all quite friendly. Yeah.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think hopefully a lot of the young people watching us and here today will feel inspired to get on board with what's happening. And I think you guys actually set the advice in a very kind of accessible way. I think, you know, you're right. Everyone has a skill. Everyone can find their part. Like what Scarlett said, it doesn't have to be a policy writer from the very beginning. You know, just work at COP, you know, volunteer at COP. So thank you guys for offering that. I do really want to open up to Q&A right now. I know we have a lot of questions. So opening up right now, does anyone have any questions to ask any of our three incredible climate youth activists? Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So yeah, I guess I had a question just about how do you guys envision the next few decades and the sort of transition from being a youth activist and as you kind of get older, like, will there be a point where you'll feel a calling to kind of try and integrate yourselves into these positions of power to then influence the system from the inside out? Or do you see yourselves kind of on the outside trying to break down the system? Yeah.
Anyone, go for it.
I think I come at this from a really weird angle because I write policy now. At 17, I've been writing policy since I was 14, which is really, really weird. I'm the youngest policy writer in the world and probably still the only under 18 out there. And I want to be a humanitarian trauma surgeon, which is quite different from policy writing, which means hopefully, even though this sounds like a weird thing to aspire to, being on the front line of the climate crisis, doing surgery and doing medicine, because we'll need people there. And I think I'll continue writing policy. I write policy, you know, as an activist, as essentially a pressure group from Fridays for Future, Teach the Future, whatever. And I don't think I'm ever going to go into those positions of power. Having like worked really closely in Parliament, I've seen just how bureaucratic the system is. There's like bans on words. So, for example, you can't say climate justice, it's a banned phrase. The literal system is so archaic and so confined that it blocks any sort of meaningful change, and it's been like that for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, you know, although policy can change things, it has to be 30 words instead of when 2 would just do, because of how silly the system is, and I don't want to, you know, sort of uphold this really ridiculous and obstructive system when I think I'd be better as a medic, and also as someone continuing to put pressure from the outside and inside through writing policy, because I think that's sort of a really good skill that I have. I'm really good at it. I know I'm really good at it, and I think it's something that needs to be there. And I think that we all sort of need to engage really critically with the political system and with positions of power, because there's good MPs out there. I could name a few now, and the fact that they haven't been able to change things despite being elected in by tens of thousands of people kind of shows how like ridiculous the system is, and shows us that whilst we need to engage within the system, we also need to engage without. So I think a mixture of the two is where I'm going to go.
Dylan or Anna, if you guys have anything to add?
Well, I think I would never be inside the building because the current system got us in this mess, and we need to completely uproot it and build it again from the foundations up. And you can't really do that once you're in this system, because you are upholding it and you're sustaining it if you're in there. So I would definitely still stay on the outside. I'm really into writing, so I would do it through that avenue, but also still be taking to the streets.
Dylan?
Yeah, I don't see myself ever going into a parliament or anything like that. I mean, sometimes people think it's us who should be running for those positions, but I don't think I could, because the system itself has to change, and like Anna was saying, you can't change that from the inside, and it's more than just getting elected. Like, even the people who influence who gets elected needs to change. For example, our media is controlled by billionaires, so even the getting elected process is corrupt, and it's all part of this big system that focuses on greed over people, and I don't think I could participate in that, and I think I'm much more useful on the outside.
Great, thank you. Yes.
We can take some questions from the online audience. We have Ismail from Libya saying, what is the best way to create a grassroots movement?
Anyone wants to start?
I think having the idea of creating a grassroots movement is the first step. You need to find people who want the same thing as you, and I think with building movements, it's really important that you're kind of all on the same page. when you start things. So that means having lots of discussions. Like, for example, we want to reach net zero. Every one of us probably wants to reach it in a slightly different way, but it's similar enough for us to work together as all three of us have in the past. So yeah, I think find people who are like you, get on the same page, make sure you want to do the same sort of stuff in the same sort of way, and then act. You know, you have so many opportunities to act, whether that's through school, workplace, or whatever, and kind of build it from there. And in this, you know, age of social media, I sound like a really old person saying that. But age of social media, you have even more ways to connect with other people and find people who are like you and just continue to act. So find what you want to do, find people who want to do the same thing, and go from there.
Dylan, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a movement can start from anywhere with anyone. I don't think like 4 years ago anyone could have predicted that the Fridays for Future movement particularly would exist, and that refusing to go to school would be such a big thing. It can really come from anywhere, and just be very open to all ideas and any way of getting what you want. And I think sometimes you can feel very alone, but even if there's nobody directly around you who has the same goals, there are people out there, and especially in the age of the internet, you can definitely find those people. So yeah, just it's quite cliche, but don't give up, because you can always do more than you think you can.
Cliche, but it's true, isn't it? Anna?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think just the beauty of a grassroots movement is how fluid it is, and how it is easier to be more intersectional inclusive, because it's not tied down to the systems we currently have, and having the ability to be non-hierarchical and things like that is also really useful.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
What do you guys think about the measures that have been taken at COP for now?
What measures? They haven't done anything. They haven't done a single thing to act as though they're in an emergency.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I mean, the whole thing is just a big circus and sponsorship to make people look good. It's like we're in this kind of big flurry of all these pledges, but there's nothing to back up those pledges. Even in the main hall, when you look around, you just see their sponsors, and all of the side events are just ways for people to look good. So yeah, safe to say I'm not very pleased.
I have to agree that we haven't actually seen any, you know, meaningful announcements or pledges from COP. In previous years, the announcement system of COP was only for pledges and policy being announced, but this year we've seen their like PR packages go out there. So lots of useless copyrighted words, basically, to like fluff out the fact that they've done nothing. And I think something that sort of really summarizes COP is the fact that we're celebrating that the phrase fossil fuels has been used, because that's not a phrase that's been used in the last 26 years. And, you know, fossil fuels is like, it's just a word. We shouldn't be celebrating a word or a phrase even. That kind of shows how dire the situation is. But like on a more positive note, I think this COP has really shown that we have the potential for a global movement for climate justice. We saw the school strike on Friday, which had tens of thousands of people. On Saturday, we had 500,000 people across the world march together for climate justice in like 30 different languages in so many different countries. And that shows that, you know, we have the people power needed for climate justice. We have that movement here. And whilst politicians inside the COP building aren't doing anything, there was 150,000 people outside demanding climate justice, demanding international climate justice and policy measures to back that.
Great, thank you guys so much. Any more questions?
We have Lara from Spain saying, what is one piece of advice you would give to young leaders when fighting to further the climate movement in their own communities?
So I think that touches on basically, you know, what we're talking about advice, but maybe you could shed more light on what they should do in their own community. Maybe, you know, from an experience that you guys have had. Maybe Anna?
I think just keep doing what you're doing. We need to keep putting the pressure on, keep holding people accountable, and we need people in every country. We need a combined holistic approach. And it doesn't have to be things that you see in social media. It doesn't have to be traditional forms of protest. And there are so many different ways, whether it's writing songs, writing books, reading books, educating yourself is so important as well. And yeah, just keep going and make sure that you're sharing the most accurate message that's most in line with the science while ensuring the concept of equity.
Scarlett?
I think with your own community, it's important to consider what's going to affect you the most. Like, not every movement is going to look the same, and I think that's a good thing because we're all affected by different things. So maybe if you're like in a region really close to the coast, looking specifically at flooding, or if you're people of colour living in inner city London, like Choked Up UK did, you know, start up a group about air pollution, do what's relevant to you and people around you, and no one's going to know that better than you. So yeah, just kind of go with what's important to you and what's affecting you.
Yeah, similar to that. Yeah, I was going to say that every community is very different. Even here, like there's a very different community on the north side of the Clyde to the south side, and they're 10 minutes from each other. Even 30 minutes away where I live, it's incredibly different again. So nobody's going to know what works there as much as you will, and it might take a few tries to figure out what is right, but you'll get there eventually. And I would also say my main advice to any activist anywhere would be try and look after yourself, because especially with COP and especially from experience, it is so easy to just completely burn yourself out, and that helps absolutely nobody. So try and look after yourself.
And you're just stemming from that. I just wanted to push you guys a little bit more. When you say taking care of yourself, what do you mean by that? How do young climate activists take care of themselves? Make sure that they don't burn out, because I'm sure it's a very hard kind of process to navigate. Like what works best for someone. So not in assuming that what works for you works for everyone else, but if you guys would like to share, how do you guys decompress? How do you make sure you don't burn out? How does that work?
I mean, obviously it depends on what you like to do. So actually yesterday I took the day off and I didn't go inside the COP. And I know that it wasn't necessarily the best thing for the movement, but I'm no use to the movement if I'm completely burned out. So I actually went up to just exist in the Highlands, which I particularly like because there's no phone service. So nobody could talk to me and I could just exist in the natural environment, and I find that incredibly healing. Even though I'm not particularly into nature, I don't like watch birds or anything, it's still incredibly healing for me to just be outside and not around my phone.
Scarlett?
I like seeing musicals and forcing everyone I know to see them with me, whether they hate musicals or not. It's fun. I think with this whole thing, like Dylan said, it's about doing your interest and making sure that you don't let like the causes you're passionate about completely consume you, because you won't be valuable to them if you're not like at your best. You're at your best by doing things you love and spending time with people you love.
Anna?
I think this might sound a bit odd, but I think that a lot of climate activists forget these things, especially when we're up doing things like COP and we're at international conferences and events, and that is drink water, get over 6 hours of sleep, eat 3 meals and 3 snacks a day, and just don't spend the entire day answering emails and answering phone calls from various media people, and you're seeing your friends you haven't seen in years from all over the world. Spend at least one evening socializing with them and not working, because these sound like little things that you might not even think about, but most activists don't do them. Like, especially with time zones, when you're on Zoom calls, it could be the middle of the day for someone, but it's 3 a.m. for you, and you'll still go to their call because they'll go to your midday call. And it's something we have to consider. And so sleep and drinking water is probably things that we should do more. We're like houseplants, and we need to respect that, because I wouldn't let my houseplant die. And I think climate activists need to keep that in mind.
I think that's so true. I think everyone in this room could probably benefit from the advice of just drinking water and having more than 6 hours of sleep. So thank you for sharing that. It really is the little things. I think going on from what you said, especially Dylan, you really touched on it, about how people forget to take care of themselves. And I think amongst climate activists, there is a sense of that initial guilt of should I not be spending every second of my time dedicating it to the fight for climate, like for climate justice. Like there is a guilt of whether I should rest or I want to read a book, but it's true, you're not going to make that change if you're burnt out. So it's all part of the process of healing and taking that time, and whether that's going to nature or watching a musical, forcing people to come with you, or drinking water. It all is different for every single person. So thank you for sharing that. Do we have any final questions from Q&A at all?
We have one final question from Renee from France. So what's the most impactful small change you can take today in your lives that would have the biggest impact?
Anna, maybe?
Well, I think obviously we need system change, not individual change. As Scarlett has already said, over 70% of emissions come from just 100 companies globally. So therefore, if we were to, switch off the lights and switch off the water when we brush our teeth, it would make absolutely no difference. Even if you recycle, 92% of what you put in a recycling bin in the UK doesn't actually get recycled. So it's a system problem, not an individual problem. But if you did want to make an individual change, I would say protest, put pressure on, lobby. Even if you can't go physically to protest, you can get involved in tweet storms, you can do things like that. Like those kind of changes will then put pressure on the system, which is what we need right now.
Dylan?
Yeah, definitely the same thing about it's system change that we need. You can make as many individual changes as you want right now, and it won't have that impact that you think it will. So you can try and take public transport, but if that public transport isn't frequent, accessible prices, then people won't take it. For example, the buses in my area, which is supposedly the really good part, they often don't come. They're every 2 hours sometimes, and they're incredibly low quality. So of course you're going to just drive. And even if you change that, you're still paying more than you really can sometimes. And even if you try to go vegan, those prices aren't accessible to everybody. So it's very much about system change, which will enable individual change, and then we can see a society that we need.
I think with individual change, if you're like in the 15% of people who take 70% of the UK's flights, stop doing that. But if you're not in that figure, the most impactful thing you can do is to stop believing that the brunt of the climate crisis on you. Learn about where the climate crisis came from. The climate crisis is the cause of extractive systems of colonialism and disaster capitalism, and it's a centuries long process of exploitation. Learn about that, and then teach 3 or 4 or hundreds of people if you want to about that. Spread the message, learn about it, and look at ways you can sort of directly get involved in action. And attend, write, do whatever you can. But unless you're in that 15% of people who take 70% of the UK's flights, or you use a 4x4 to go 2 minutes down the road, you don't need to change much substantially. But you obviously can, of course. I feel like with the climate crisis, because there's so many themes of guilt, when you're acting, it feels like I guess it's a bit selfish wanting to take the guilt off away from yourself, but doing things like cutting out meat, not even going vegan or vegetarian, but having it a few times less a week, taking public transport when you can, doing that sort of stuff can make you perhaps feel better about yourself. But it's definitely not the difference between climate justice and climate crisis.
Thank you, all of you guys, for that. We have a few minutes left, and I just want to ask my final question, because we have really looked at, the issues with the system right now, capitalism, humanitarian kind of aspects of climate change. And just to end on a really light note, I'd really like all three of you just, maybe if we could just do a really quick fire round, 30 seconds each. If you could just tell us what's your proudest moment been so far in the climate activism march. This wasn't in the briefing, I know, so none of you guys are prepped for this, but just, the raw honesty, when, if any, if there hasn't been, that's completely fine, but the proudest moment you've had where you thought, hey, maybe there is a glimmer of hope, or hey, I do feel like we have a community going on. Just 30 seconds of telling us what has been the proudest moment for you guys. What's giving you guys hope? Scarlett, you go ahead.
I've got 2. So the first is on September 20th, 2019, we had a double-decker bus as a stage, and standing on top of that and seeing 100,000 people, there joining us to strike for the climate strike for climate justice, strike from their jobs, school, and whatever else, was really heartening. And I think the second one was when I organised the first ever Westminster Hall debate on climate education. So I saw MPs who were criticising the school strikes, but reading out speeches that I had written, not knowing I'd done it because they thought an MP had, and actually advocating the cause and seeing MPs from all across the House actually put forward really promising measures towards climate education, which is actually the only area where we're moving forward on climate justice.
Great. Dylan?
I get very stressed when I'm asked to talk about myself. Scottish cringe is kind of like that. I'm physically incapable of thinking of things I'm proud of, but I guess similar to that, the strike last Friday was pretty cool. It was our biggest one ever, but at the same time, it couldn't have happened without like everybody else. So I don't want to I don't know how to accept pride or whatever.
And last but not least.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say the same one as Scarlett, but on a lot smaller scale. Obviously, Northern Ireland isn't London. We have 1.8 million people in the entire country. You guys have more just in the city, but we had 7,000 people take to the streets of Belfast, and there was a climate emergency declared in the city council as a direct result of that. And then once our government stopped being collapsed, we got one for the whole country as soon as it got back together because of the strike. So that made me feel quite hopeful, but nothing came of it. It was an empty promise. They haven't done anything to act as though they are in a climate emergency. So I don't have something that is true pride. It doesn't exist because we've been let down too many times.
Great. Thank you guys so much for sharing that. I feel like it was a much lighter note to end with compared to all of what we were speaking about. So I feel like most people here have something to take away right now. Thank you all so much for coming. This is the end of the panel. If you could guys please give a round of applause to the most incredible youth climate activists here. They have absolutely killed it and provided us with so much to take home. So please go home thinking